Yeah, so BUD PR, that's our acronym for Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, or Puerto Ricans United in the diaspora. We're an organization of Puerto Ricans here in the United States mostly, although we have a couple members who have moved back to Puerto Rico after being with us here in the States, which we're always sad to lose them as part of the diaspora, but really excited that they got to return home, as many of us would like to do. But yeah, but PR is a national advocacy organization focused on Puerto Rico's decolonization and sovereignty. That's really our main issue is Puerto Rico's colonial status. And we operate as sort of a national network of leaders and collaborators in different states who do education, organizing, and advocacy for that goal. So the organization started in 2017. Started a little bit before Hurricane Maria. Actually, a lot of folks think we started as a response to Hurricane Maria, but the org started a little bit before that. I wasn't there at the beginning. I joined in end of 2020, beginning of 2021, when I moved here to the US again after living in Puerto Rico for a few years. And it really started to fill a need that the co-founders saw, that there needed to be a political organization that is explicitly focused on the status issue, that is explicitly focused on decolonization and independence. We know that there's other great organizations, focused on Puerto Rico or on Latinos that tackle other issues. And obviously, we know that other sides and folks with other ideas about Puerto Rico's political future have their own organizations, their own lobbyists, their own structures to try to achieve what they want to achieve. So, we thought that there needed to be an organization like that for folks who believe in Puerto Rico's sovereignty.
Wow. So it started in 2017, right?
That's right. Yeah. So just
Okay.
still under 10 years old, still growing, but I like to think we've achieved quite a bit in these last few years.
Insane response of the Trump administration at that time to Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria. I mean, watching those hurricanes hit the island and how did that make you feel watching that back in 2017 and the response of the government?
Yeah, and in my case, not just watching it but living it, because I
Mm,
was there. And I'm born and raised in Puerto Rico. I've spent most of my life there still. I've lived back and forth between Puerto Rico and the States. Lived in Boston for a few years. Now I'm here in Colorado, where I've been for the past 4 or 5 years or so. But from 2016 to the end of 2020, I was living in Puerto Rico. Lived through Hurricane Maria. I was staying with my parents at that time. They had a generator, so we were among the lucky ones, with a huge asterisk, right? Because everybody suffered to some extent, but certainly many people suffered way more than I did. But it was an incredibly difficult time. In some ways, it's not even over, right? Because Puerto Rico's never really fully recovered from Hurricane Maria, and a lot of that
right.
is about those failures, at the local level, but definitely at the federal level. And the big feeling that I had about it at the time, and that I continue to have now, is this is all a symptom, right? This is all why this happened in Puerto Rico, why not the hurricane itself, obviously, but the terrible response and the Trump
Right.
administration and all this stuff. It's all a symptom of the larger disease, which is the colonial status. So I think that's how it felt to me then, and how it still feels to me now.
Yeah, for sure. It was heartbreaking, man. Heartbreaking watching that. I work for MTA, just a regular Joe, and broke my heart watching that. But the response was so shameful, and it's kind of sad how quickly people forgot, right? How quickly people forgot him and his administration just let our people die. And most of the island is veterans, right? If I'm not mistaken,
I mean, I don't
elderly
think
and
most in
veterans.
terms of a majority, but certainly there's always been a lot of a pretty high percentage of Puerto Ricans that do sign up for the armed forces. So but this is just the one episode in a whole history of neglect and abuse. And part of it was the Trump administration, but honestly, it kept going afterwards. With with a different party and a different president, and all these stories about how the electric grid got worse and things didn't get fixed, and FEMA money was still being held up. A lot of this started under Trump, but then continued under Biden, and obviously now it continues again under Trump. So that's always been one of my big frustrations too with this topic. That image of Donald Trump throwing paper towels at Puerto Ricans got like seared in people's minds, and it became like, oh, this is just a matter of like Trump being bad, which I think he is, and that's certainly part of it. But it's more than one guy. It's more than paper towels. It's really a structural, systemic issue arising again from the colonial status.
Right. Okay, so Bud PR starts in 2017. When did you join and why?
So I joined at the very end of 2020, beginning of 2021. I moved out here to Colorado with my wife, and I met one of the other or one of the co-founders of Bud PR who lives out here and who's still a leader in our organization, Luis Ponce. And it was just a great kind of treat for me to run into another, politically inclined, pro-independence Puerto Rican here in Colorado, and he was helping lead this organization. So I started getting involved at that time, just as a contributor, and then eventually joined the board, and been the president of Bud PR now for the last couple of years. We operate with a small board of directors, and then kind of, as I said, as a network of collaborators. And I joined because this is the topic of political status has always mattered to me. I've always been passionate about it. I think most people on the island, it's sometimes considered kind of our national obsession, right? For good reason, I think. And I wanted to use my time, my skills to do something and to fill what I saw as a big need for conversation, for debate, for discussion, for action on this topic here in the United States. One of the sort of main reasons for Bud PR existing is this idea that those of us who are here in the diaspora have a power, a political power that Puerto Ricans on the islands don't, right? They can't vote for the president. They don't have, lawmakers, senators, congressmen that they can reach out to and say, hey, I care about this and I vote for you. So, I want a meeting to talk about Puerto Rico. We can do that. And we do that here, as the part of the work of our organization. And so, to to quote the famous Spider-Man thing, with great power comes great responsibility. So I think those of us who do have that political power here in the U.S. to do something about Puerto Rico have a responsibility to use it, and I certainly felt and feel that responsibility. So I wanted to join an organization that would help me do that. All governments have debt, right? This is just a part of how governments function. The United States is, hundreds of billions, or I don't even know if it's over $1 trillion in debt now. This is just part of how governments, fund public projects, right? Most governments, it's just like having a loan, right? Or having a mortgage or a car payment or something. It's you go into debt, but you're paying off that debt, so everything's fine. But Puerto Rico, because of its precarious economic situation, which, if you're me, again, not to belabor the point, but part of the colonial status and the limitations, the restrictions that puts on Puerto Rico's economic development, not to mention the more direct economic exploitation that happens. Puerto Rico is very limited economically, so it's been very reliant. The government has been on debt to just fund its operations and to fund public projects. And as the economy got worse, after the Great Recession, talking 15 years ago now, 10, 15 years ago, it got to a point where Puerto Rico could no longer pay its debt, and so we had this huge debt crisis. I think the total was over $70 billion, not counting pension obligations, which is a sort of separate but related thing. So Puerto Rico gets to the point in which it can no longer pay its debt. Now, what usually happens when you can't pay your debt? You declare bankruptcy. And there's a structured process for you to be able to pay down some of the debt at least, and the people who you owe money to aren't going to get all of their money back, but they're going to get some of it, and that's how it gets worked out. Problem is that because Puerto Rico is a colony, Puerto Rico cannot file for bankruptcy. Like Congress had actually taken away Puerto Rico's ability to file for bankruptcy when they amended its bankruptcy code back in the 80s. And so Puerto Rico's in between a rock and a hard place where it's got all this debt, it can't pay it off, it can't file for bankruptcy. So that's how we end up with La Junta and a lot of this other stuff that I know we're gonna talk about. And get into this process where you have the U.S. government getting involved to create a process for Puerto Rico to restructure its debt. But that's kind of the basics of how it all started. I mean, you could go back years and years and years to talk about the roots of Puerto Rico's economic crises and things like the eliminations and even decades. But I think the basic is Puerto Rico needed to issue a lot of debt to fund the government. Basically, it got to a point where it couldn't, pay that debt, and because it couldn't file for bankruptcy, then we ended up with these laws like Promesa and this financial oversight board.
If I'm not mistaken, even one of the previous governors, right? I think his name was Fortuno or something like that. Wasn't he taking out incredible loans from all these big banks at like 500% interest rates or something like that?
I mean, all governors and governments of Puerto Rico have been responsible for accruing, this debt, some more than others, and it did grow. I think more than in some other cycles during Luis Fortuno's governorship. But again, it's one of these things, kind of like I was saying with Trump and Hurricane Maria. Like, it's more than just one bad guy who made bad decisions. It's like a deep structural issue of the fact that Puerto Rico does not have the tools of economic development and the ability to thrive economically under its current status. So it gets stuck in these terrible kind of cycles of debt and again, like almost like it's not a perfect comparison, but almost like what happens to an individual. Like if they can't thrive economically, well, they're going to take on a lot of debt because they still have to like buy food and pay bills, right? So it becomes a structural issue where you're kind of stuck in these vicious circles.
Okay, all right. So the debt gets, like you said, it's all these different things going on. The government has to pay for all these things going on in the country, right? So now the debt is kind of where it is. Who is owed that money? The debt that Puerto Rico currently has right now, who's owed that debt?
Yeah, and that's an important question because I think some people have this misconception that Puerto Rico owes this money to the United States, meaning like to the U.S. government, and that's not the case. Like the vast majority of the debt is both before it started getting restructured and what's still outstanding debt is owned by basically private investors. Some of it is just kind of individuals who they technically might own some of Puerto Rico's debt just from like the index funds or their 401k or these bond these funds that you're like Fidelity and all these places you might be able to invest in just as part of your regular investments. And it's not like an individual chose to buy a Puerto Rico municipal bond. It's just part of what was kind of in the package of these funds that you get invested into. But there are tens of billions of it that are also owned by hedge funds, by what are sometimes called vulture funds, because they like vultures kind of swoop up when when things are dying almost, right? In this case, when Puerto Rico's financial situation got so bad and these junks got or these bonds got junk rated, so they were able to buy them up real cheap, and now they've been fighting in court to try to get a bunch of the to really try to make a profit on it. So a lot of the big fights that are happening over the debt right now is these hedge funds, these vulture funds, organizations, companies that manage tens, hundreds of billions of dollars, who still owe some of Puerto Rico's debt and are basically trying to squeeze as much money as they can out of it.
Wow. Okay, so the debt, I believe at one point was around like $85 billion, right? Or 90 billion or something like that. For a country being so small in a population, I think what is it, 3 million people in Puerto Rico.
Mhm.
What is the result of being that much in debt for an island so small with a population so small? What have been some of the results?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. One of the big results is that when you get to the point where you can't pay your debts, you're sort of locked out of the market, right? It's like having bad credit as a person. You're not going to be able to
Mm,
take on more loans. You're not going to be able to borrow more money, and so that incredibly limits Puerto Rico's ability to issue more debt, to get some of the money that it needs to fund the government, to run basic services, and sometimes but really the biggest thing that's happened is because of what, as I mentioned, the United States did to help, with very big air quotes, Puerto Rico get a handle on this debt situation, which is they passed this law Promesa in 2016, signed into law by President Obama, and it creates a financial oversight board for Puerto Rico, which Puerto Ricans often call La Junta, and it's basically a series of seven bureaucrats, really appointed by the President of the United States, who are put in charge of Puerto Rico's debt restructuring process. But the law gives that board such extraordinary power that it sort of puts it in charge of all of Puerto Rico's finances. And what that
Essentially,
board,
they're more powerful than the Puerto Rican government itself, right?
oh, absolutely, yeah, yeah, yeah. To the point that whenever Puerto Rico's elected government, elected legislature passes a law now, they have to basically write a memo to the board and say, like, hey, is this law okay?
Wow.
And the board, who nobody elected, who is just seven people appointed by the president, gets to decide if they think the law is going to be good for Puerto Rico's finances or budget. Then fine. If they think it's not good or doesn't meet their fiscal plan, then they can just block the law's implementation. Um, and the elected governor of Puerto Rico can't do anything about it. So these seven people, who nobody elected, are more powerful, as you said, than the government of the people elected by Puerto Rico in a supposed act of democracy.
Mm,
And these are folks who ideologically believe in austerity, believe that the way to right Puerto Rico's finances is to cut pensions, cut funding for public education, for other public services. So what they've done for the last almost 10 years now is this massive austerity program in Puerto Rico to basically cut the government's budget so that there can be money to pay off these bondholders. Yes, they have restructured some of the debt and saved Puerto Rico some money in that sense. That's what they were put there to do. It's what would have happened, ideally in a better way, through a kind of Chapter 9 bankruptcy. But the effects on Puerto Rico have been disastrous. They're behind the privatization of the electric grid and Luma, and the disaster that's been for Puerto Rico. And you look at everything that's crumbling on the island, from education, from healthcare, all these key services and institutions. A lot of that can be traced back to this kind of austerity program imposed by this federally appointed board.
wow. And what are some of the salaries? So you said seven people on this board. Do we know how much they make, or um, do they
Yeah.
make money at all, or is it all seven make money on salaries? How does that work?
So the seven board members themselves do not have a salary, although it's very interesting that the law actually allows them to like accept gifts. So, we'll never know what kind of potentially under the table stuff is going on.
Wow. So
Um,
they can accept gifts by just anybody, or
Yeah, yeah, it doesn't put any limitations
wow.
on what they can accept. So the seven board members themselves, don't draw a salary, but the board does have a staff led by an executive director. Right now, that executive director is Robert Mujica, who used to be Andrew Cuomo's budget chief when Cuomo was governor of New York. And Robert Mujica alone, right now, makes $625,000 a year, which is like
Wow.
a higher salary than the president of the United States. And then you have other staff with salaries, and what the board has really done, which has been especially egregious, is hire armies of consultants and lawyers, And I think, according to the estimates I've seen since the board started in 2016, they've spent about $2 billion total in,
Oh my God.
consultants, law firms, and all of that is paid for by the Puerto Rican people. So that's kind of the insult to injury, even though this was, it's a body appointed by Congress. It's budget, and any money that the board spends, the Puerto Rican people have to pay for it. So we're sort of paying this this entity to screw us over, because that's what the federal law says we have to do.
Wow. Do we know who is behind this board being created? We know, so Obama signed it in officially in 2016 before he left office. Was this being pushed for before, maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, before Obama officially signed it? Who might have been behind creating this board, the idea of it? Because I doubt it was Obama, right?
It was really a very bipartisan effort, and like I said, going back to this point of, um, it's not just always Trump, it's not just the Republicans. Like, it had to be bipartisan for it to pass. If you think about how little gets passed in Congress these days, it has to have support from both parties. So, when Puerto Rico's debt crisis exploded, there were other ideas, there were other options on the table. For example, some people said, hey, before we even do anything or try to restructure this debt, let's do an audit of the debt. Like, why doesn't the federal government mandate an audit of the debt? Because maybe some of the debt was accrued illegally and doesn't have to get paid. This should be like a step one thing that we do. Congress didn't want to do that. There was another proposal on the table to get Puerto Rico back into the bankruptcy code, and to return to Puerto Rico the power that it had had before 1984, to actually just declare Chapter 9 bankruptcy, and it'll be a process through the courts. There doesn't have to be an oversight board involved. That was shut down. Congress didn't want to do that either. Puerto Rico passed its own local bankruptcy law to try to, give itself the power to declare bankruptcy but the federal courts said, nope, you can't do that, Puerto Rico. Federal law applies in Puerto Rico, and federal law says that you cannot declare bankruptcy. So there were all these other options on the table that frankly would have been better than what ended up happening. I can't sit here and tell you that I know exactly which lobbyists or which firms were pushing for something like this Promesa law and this oversight board. But what I can tell you is that Congress basically chose the option to deal with this problem that would give them the most power, the most leverage in the process, that would ensure that they can control to some extent, who's in charge of who gets paid and who doesn't get paid. In this debt process for Puerto Rico. And I think now what's happened in the last month or so, what Trump has been doing in relation to the board, is like the most extreme example. Beginning of August, Donald Trump fired basically 6 of the 7 members of the oversight board. To this date, he hasn't replaced them. I think the expectation is that he'll replace them sometime in September or October. And it kind of happened after this pressure campaign that was underway for a couple months, led by some far right figures. So Laura Loomer is a big one, who, she's this activist who apparently has the Trump's ear and is very involved in White House affairs. And, their kind of excuse for firing them was a lot of this stuff that we've been talking about, of like, oh, they've been bad for Puerto Rico. Look at this. They spend so much money, and Puerto Rico's still struggling, which is true. But, I at least don't believe, and I don't think most reasonable people should believe, that, Trump is especially concerned about the Puerto Rican people, right? And that he's looking out for our best interests. No, what, most people are pretty sure is happening, and pretty sure is going to happen, is that Trump is going to appoint some people to the board who are even friendlier to these, billionaires and bondholders and vulture funds, who are going to seek to make sure that those companies can profit even more, even if it means that Puerto Ricans have to suffer more. So, for example, right now, one of the big fights is that a couple of these, hedge funds want the electricity prices to be increased in Puerto Rico, which they're already like the highest in the U.S., one of the highest in the world. Let's hike the rates up even more so that there can be more money in the coffers, so that Puerto Rico, so that the bondholders can make more money. So this is the fight they were having in court, and they were losing in court. So, I think there's some kind of lobbyist pressure and say, let's get rid of these board members and let's bring in some new ones who will be friendlier, and we'll cut a better deal for these billionaires, many of whom, by the way, are big Trump donors. There's a big article about this in the Washington Examiner a couple of days ago, that some donors to Trump might be set to make billions more from the moves Trump's been making on the board. So it speaks to the last question that you asked, like, why did Congress do this? It's like, well, it's kind of to preserve maximum leverage and control for the U.S. government, in this case for a government led by Trump, to be able to make the moves he wants to make, and to make sure that the people that he wants to profit can profit.
Yeah, I remember back in 2017, or right after the hurricanes, 2018 and 19. I remember, I don't know if it was exactly in 2017 or 18, but I remember around that time, even Puerto Rico's sales tax, it went up to, I think, 11.5%, or something to that, close to that number, which is kind of insane, right? Because Puerto Rico's, I think, 3 times poorer than the poorest U.S. state, which is Mississippi, but yet their sales tax is higher than, say, New York City, which is insane if you think about that, right?
Yeah, Puerto Rico pays some of the highest, local taxes of anywhere in the U.S., I think, and you're absolutely right. I think twice or a little more than twice as poor as Mississippi. Half the median household income of Mississippi, which is the poorest state. 40% of people under the poverty line, including almost 60% of children. So it speaks to this point of, like, there's this idea that the U.S. is keeping Puerto Rico afloat, right, or even helping Puerto Rico flourish economically, and that it would be some big socioeconomic disaster without the United States. I think 60% of children living in poverty is a pretty big socioeconomic disaster already. So, maybe we gotta rethink how we evaluate some of this stuff. Yeah, and actually, there's 2 different Jones Acts, and one of them is the citizenship one, and one of them is the maritime shipping one. So the Jones Act from 1917, technically the Jones-Shafroth Act, was the law that made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. Made some other reforms to Puerto Rico's government, and then after that comes what is most commonly referred to now as the Jones Act, or the Maritime Shipping Act, or laws, as we call it sometimes, and that basically regulates, and this isn't just for Puerto Rico, it's for all of the United States, that any cargo that is transported by ship between U.S. ports has to be on U.S. built, U.S. flagged, U.S. crewed vessels. So this really limits, for an island like Puerto Rico, which is again, an island, so incredibly dependent on trade by ship, on maritime shipping. It affects Hawaii a lot too, for the same reasons. It really limits the kinds of ships and companies that Puerto Rico can use to import even basics like food and fuel. Puerto Rico, unfortunately, imports nearly 90% of its food, and so
insane, 90%, right?
Yeah,
some of the most fertile land on the planet, and they import 90% of their agriculture.
Yeah, and that's a whole different topic, and thankfully there's been kind of a movement in recent years to try to really rescue the agriculture sector in Puerto Rico, and engage some food sovereignty efforts, which are I think incredibly important. But yeah, going back to the Jones Act, this is kind of one of the biggest pieces that really hurts Puerto Ricans economically. I think the studies have shown that it costs the average Puerto Rican family hundreds of dollars, even up to $1,000 a year, just from everything being more expensive, because it has to be brought in on what's usually a more expensive ship. So if Panama had some great ships and they were willing to, transport, goods to Puerto Rico, well, and then, the products would actually be cheaper because we didn't pay as much for the import. Well, Puerto Rico can't do that because the Jones Act says that we have to use U.S. ships, basically. So, it's one of the many, many things that it's just like a federal law, a decision by the U.S. government. Puerto Ricans have advocated for, it to be eliminated or for an exemption from the Jones Act for years, and Congress has always just completely ignored that request or that demand. It's just another federal law that hurts Puerto Rican families every day.
For sure. I used to work with a group called Respect and Justice for Puerto Rico. We did an event in Jacksonville, Florida. So just real quick for the audience that are watching this, an avocado from Dominican Republic cannot enter Puerto Rico legally. It has to be shipped to Jacksonville, Florida, put on an American ship, American-made ship, which are the most expensive in the world, then shipped to Puerto Rico, which Puerto Rico pays for that commute. And then once it lands in Puerto Rico, there's a couple of companies that actually set the price, which I don't know. I've never lived in Puerto Rico, but it's a lot. Groceries can be sometimes more expensive than here in the States, right?
Oh yeah,
From
absolutely.
my
Yeah,
from my understanding, because of this part of the Jones or this version of the Jones Act, and these companies are benefiting from those higher prices, right? So an avocado from DR legally can't even enter Puerto Rico. I mean, just another form of just insane abuse, right?
yeah. And Jacksonville's ground zero for this because it's, the hub of all these shipping companies like Crowley that really benefit from the Jones Act and that lobby to keep it in place.
Oh, absolutely. Crowley, Tote. When we were down there, we learned. In fact, they actually threatened an organization that we were working with down there in Florida that we better not do. We did a little something in the town to kind of raise awareness, and they threatened that organization in their own way, um, because they didn't want that to. Because they actually pay so much in lobbying politicians in Washington to make sure they don't even understand how this Jones Act affects Puerto Rico in terms of what we're discussing. So purposely they want people to be confused about it because they're making billions off of this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the fact that Puerto Rico is so dependent on, trade from the U.S. and on imports makes it, a big sort of money making machine for a lot of these companies, and not just shipping companies, for all kinds of, industries and businesses in the United States. And I think it's a really important thing to highlight for everyone. Like, so many of these conversations about the U.S. and Puerto Rico relationship, no matter what we're talking about, at the end of the day, follow the money. This is kind of
Absolutely.
rule number one in politics, right?
Right.
And it's sort of rule number one for thinking about the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. Follow the money, and you're probably going to find some stuff that Puerto Ricans are getting screwed, and somebody in the U.S. is making some cash. So Act 20 and Act 22 were two tax incentives that were passed in Puerto Rico. These are local laws. I think almost 10 years ago, or a little over 10 years ago now, initially, to do a couple of different things. Act 20 was for Puerto Rican, businesses, and to offer some tax incentives for folks who wanted to grow their business or establish a business, especially if they were going to, engage in exports. Act 22, which is the one that most people are usually talking about in this context, and the one that's been most damaging, is a tax incentive for people who are not Puerto Rican, or who have, had never lived in Puerto Rico, who moved to Puerto Rico, and they have the ability, if they meet some conditions, to not pay any, capital gains tax, so taxes on investments, other forms of tax on passive income. So it's incredibly attractive to investors, to crypto folks, to a lot of really rich people who investment income is one of their main sources of income. And so then a few years ago, these two laws got kind of combined and wrapped up into what's now known as Act 60, which includes the provisions from several of these original laws. But Act 60, and especially those provisions from the original Act 22, what they've really done is that they've opened the island up to what a lot of us call sort of a new crop, a new generation of colonizers, right? Who come to live in Puerto Rico, not because they, love it, because they want to contribute to it, because they want to be part of the community. They come to save money. They come to exploit Puerto Rico economically in different ways. It's attracted a
Jake
lot of,
Paul and others.
yeah, exactly. It's attracted a lot of crypto folks. It's attracted a lot of real estate people who, buy up properties, sometimes buy up almost whole city blocks to turn them into Airbnbs. They'll evict longtime residents by or hike up the rent on them to an extent that they can't pay. So it's created or exacerbated a housing crisis in Puerto Rico, where housing prices, rent prices have gone up. And when it's fueled a kind of gentrification and displacement and cultural shift in Puerto Rico, that is ongoing, and that is really concerning. And for folks who have seen, when Bad Bunny released his new album, Debí Tirar Más Fotos, he also released a short film with that. And it's kind of that vision of Puerto Rico's future, in which a lot of these, rich Americans have sort of bought up properties and taken over, and the cafecito on the corner becomes a whole different thing, and it can really shift just the culture and the identity of entire communities, and a lot of it can be traced back to these laws, which unfortunately are local laws. And I think, kind of like with the debt, it's some of the bad structures that Puerto Rico has gotten stuck into because it doesn't have the economic tools that it would have as a sovereign nation to really thrive. So it tries some of these kind of like patches and band-aids and get rich quick schemes, like, oh, let's just offer a bunch of rich people incentives to come live here, that'll be great. But they don't actually create jobs. They don't really contribute meaningfully to the economy. They're just there sort of enriching themselves.
Right, until they want to move, and then they just leave, and again,
Right.
there's no contribution to the youth, to the elderly, to just the better life, right? A better way of living out there. They don't care. They're there for the tax breaks or whatever they're there for. But once they're done, they just leave, and without really contributing nothing to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and the reporting on this has been very clear, and especially work by the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico. Because if they were doing all this stuff, but they were creating a ton of jobs, or they were really like meaningfully
Right.
improving the Puerto Rican economy, then at least you would say, okay, it's a trade-off, right?
Right.
But they're not even doing that. They're not actually like making meaningful contributions to improving Puerto Rico's economic situation. So we're getting all the bad parts of it without getting the good parts of it.
Right.
So historically, Puerto Rico's political parties have been defined by the question of Puerto Rico's status. So, since Puerto Rico got to start electing its own governors, which didn't happen until 1948, because before that the president appointed Puerto Rico's governor. There's sort of been three parties that have historically been there. There's been a pro-statehood party, which is the Partido Nuevo Progresista. Although in the early decades it was actually a different statehood party, but for the last 50, 60 years or so, it's been the Partido Nuevo Progresista, which calls itself progressive but really isn't. There are both Democrats and Republicans in that party, but it has, especially in recent years, I think, taken a really hard right turn. And right now the governor, who is from that party, Jennifer Gonzalez, is a conservative who supports Trump, and who was even co-chair of Latinos for Trump during his first run.
Pro-Trump, I think, is an understatement. I believe she stated she wanted to make a statue of Trump in Puerto Rico at some point.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have statues of all the U.S. presidents in Puerto Rico, and I don't think the Trump one is done yet. But she's working on it, or maybe they did finish it. I forget. It's funny because actually, there was a big pro-independence march in Puerto Rico.
Yes, beautiful turnout.
Yeah, and one of the things they did, because protests in Puerto Rico are always super creative, and there's always some kind of artistic element. Somebody put kind of like fake KKK hoods on the statues of the presidents in Puerto Rico. But yeah, no, I mean you're right that she's a very, very MAGA Republican, unfortunately, running Puerto Rico right now. And I think emblematic of what's been happening with the statehood party. Then you have the what you would call the pro Commonwealth or pro status quo party, which is the Partido Popular Democrático. also kind of a mix of some more slightly liberal people and some more conservative people. Um, but generally, the party's defined by the fact that they think Puerto Rico status is either fine as it is, or that you can tinker around the edges with it, maybe get the U.S. to give us like a little bit more autonomy here, a little more power there. It's not really clear that that's legal or politically possible, but that's what they believe in. And so those two parties have been the parties that have dominated Puerto Rican politics, since the 1950s.
And there
And
is a pro-independence party also, right?
yeah. So historically, the Independence Party, which has been around since 1946, I believe, it was kind of sort of like the Green Party in the U.S. in the sense that it would get kind of single-digit percentages in elections. It would usually have a small presence in the legislature in Puerto Rico. One senator and one representative, something like that. So it was a really, really kind of super minority party. But what's happened in the last decade or so, and the incredibly, extraordinary shifts that are happening in Puerto Rican politics, is that a lot of that has changed. So the political duopoly, right, that the pro statehood and pro status quo party had for decades is kind of crumbling. Those two parties used to combine for like 97% of the vote. In the last election, they combined for like 60-some% of the vote. The in 2024, the candidate from the Independence Party, Juan Dalmau, who ran for governor, he ran sort of he sort of created like an electoral alliance with another party that has emerged in the last few years, Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, which is another sort of center-left party. And Dalmau, running for the Independence Party, got over 30% of the vote, which is the highest total that the independence movement has had in its history, and actually got second place in the election, ahead of the pro status quo party, which had never happened. So big shifts happening, in Puerto Rican politics right now, I think, as a response to all of these crises and all of these things that have been happening in the last decade on the island.
Yeah, for sure, right? I mean, I believe even Bad Bunny endorsed him, no? Residente, um, a lot of
Yeah.
celebrities from yeah.
Yeah, the final rally for the campaign last year, I was watching it on YouTube from here. It was like a huge party and concert, and there's tens of thousands of people, and yeah, performances by Residente, by Bad Bunny, a bunch of other artists. So yeah, it became like this really big cultural and political moment. It didn't lead to a win for the Independence Party yet, right? Not in 2024, but I think people got to understand that this is a party that in 2016 their gubernatorial candidate got 2% of the vote, and in
Right.
2024 it got 32% of the vote. So we're talking about exponential growth in support for that party, and similar results happening in the plebiscites and some of these status votes that Puerto Rico has on its political status.
But even if they did win, I mean, is there any way they could maybe manipulate some of the results from that election over there? Again, the corruption is so rampant over there, right? Even if the Independence Party, how you pronounce his name,
Dalmau, yeah.
Dalmado, even if he did win, would there maybe any way he could have gotten screwed out of that election? Because the support was, like you said, it was never seen before. The Independence Party never got that many votes in the history of um, that
Yeah.
election over there.
Yeah, there's been reports of, irregularities in Puerto Rican elections for a long time. One of the things that the pro statehood party did, not even this last time, but I think a couple of election cycles ago, is they sort of did a takeover or they changed the laws for Puerto Rico's electoral commission, the entity that runs Puerto Rico's elections, and they've made all kinds of policy changes and structural changes there to sort of assume one party control over how Puerto Rico's elections are run. So definitely a lot of concerns there and a lot of things to look at. I don't know if I'd sit here and tell you that Dalmau had the election stolen from him. I don't think there's evidence for that. But either way, I think both are true at the same time. There are a lot of shady things that happen in in Puerto Rican elections, and the statehood party especially is always seems to be involved in some shady dealings. Um, but hopefully that doesn't detract from continuing to push for electoral wins, continuing hopefully to improve and clean up Puerto Rico's electoral system. But I think many of us, myself included, despite all of that crap that happened or may have happened, feel really really optimistic and inspired by the growth of the independence movement, and just kind of progressive politics, and sort of an opposition party in Puerto Rico to this corrupt political duopoly that's governed us for the last, like I said, since we've been able to sort of govern ourselves, since 1948. Yeah, so the plebiscites are basically, non-binding votes on Puerto Rico status. When I say non-binding, it means that Congress is not obligated to do anything with the results, no matter what the results are. So there's been 7 of these plebiscites in Puerto Rico's history. The first one in 1967. Then they sort of took a break for a while and started having them again in the 90s. And there's been 6 of them since, from 1993 to this most recent one in 2024. And they're very controversial for a couple reasons. One is because, again, they are non-binding, so it's sort of what's the point here, guys? Are we basically just doing like a fancy public opinion poll on how people feel about the political status if the results aren't going to matter? The second piece is basically the party that's in charge of the government at the time gets to decide what's on the ballot. So there's always all these controversies and questions of, do we offer people all the options, or what options do we offer? For example, in 2020, the plebiscite was just statehood, yes or no. It wasn't let's give everybody all the options and let them choose. It was just the option that the party in power wanted. Let's ask a yes or no question on that. In 2024, the options were statehood, sovereign free association, and independence. So the people who believe in the status quo still, which they're dwindling, but they're still there, we're mad about that, right? So the ballot design and what even gets included is kind of the other big piece why a lot of people don't care about these or trust these votes as a way to try to resolve Puerto Rico status. And then the third piece is that they do, especially these last few ones, they kind of get used as just political get out the vote strategies for the statehood party, especially. Say they have a candidate running for governor who isn't super popular, like I would argue the one right now, who, she loves Trump. I don't think most Puerto Ricans love Trump. Well, what else can we do to make sure that our people turn out? Okay, let's do a status vote, because even if they don't come out to vote for her, maybe voting for statehood will motivate them to turn out. So, people react to that too, and there's all kinds of boycotts and stuff that make the results of these plebiscites not always a great sort of barometer of how Puerto Ricans feel about the status issue. So yeah, very, very controversial, very complex. The results have kind of been all over the place. I will say that I sometimes I argue with this about this with some other independence advocates. I like them. I think they should keep happening. I think it's one of the few ways that Puerto Ricans have to express ourselves on the question of our political future. So even as I acknowledge all the problems with them, I think that expression is important. And what we saw in 2024, when independence and sovereign free association combined for over 40% of the vote in that plebiscite, is that I think they can serve as a reflection of how perspectives and visions of what people want is changing. So yeah, they're messed up, they're manipulated, they're boycotted, they're all that stuff. But there's also something there, right? It is Puerto Ricans actually trying to express themselves about this.
Now, in terms of like federal support, is it equal amongst states and Puerto Rico in terms of just federal support?
No, not at all. And especially when it comes to things like Medicare and Medicaid, there are limits on how much money the United States can send to Puerto Rico, or the extent to which those programs are federally funded compared to the states. Um, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it usually amounts to differences of billions of dollars per year. So Congress basically gets to make the rules when it comes to Puerto Rico, and if it wants to exclude it from certain federal programs, as it does with supplemental security income, for example, SSI, it can do that. If it wants to just fund programs at a lower rate in Puerto Rico than it would in the states, it can do that too. And that's because Puerto Rico's under what's called the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution that says Congress can basically make the rules when it comes to its territories. And in the case of Puerto Rico, it usually decides rules to send us less money than they would or than they do the rest of the states.
Right. And how about FEMA, for example? Puerto Rico pays into FEMA. Is that correct, or am I mistaken?
I think indirectly. My
Okay.
understanding is that FEMA is, just sort of funded by the U.S. government's general fund and by appropriations passed by Congress. A lot of that comes from, obviously federal income tax, which Puerto Ricans largely don't pay unless they live in Puerto Rico and work for the federal government. But some of that money, I believe, does come from payroll taxes, which is, your Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, the stuff that gets taken out of your paycheck, which Puerto Ricans do pay. So that's the other thing to understand sometimes about this idea that Puerto Rico doesn't pay taxes and gets all these federal benefits. Well, a lot of what Puerto Rico gets is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. That's not a gift. That's Puerto Ricans paying into those systems
Right.
in our paychecks. So that's a huge part of the sort of total amount of money that the U.S. sends to Puerto Rico. A lot of it is veterans benefits, which, as you mentioned, a lot of veterans in Puerto Rico that earn those benefits in a different way. So yeah, Puerto Ricans on the island do not pay federal income taxes. Pay a lot of other really high local taxes, as we were talking about, and that's certainly part of that conversation. But through payroll taxes, in other ways, we do end up contributing to some extent, at least, to these systems. Every single Instagram comment and whenever Bud PR we put some of our content out there, it's this scapegoat of corruption. And let me say first, like, it is true, like the governments in Puerto Rico, including this current one, have been corrupt. I would argue that the fact that it's been all of them tells you that, again, we're not dealing with bad individuals, we're dealing with a bad system. Like, if Puerto Rico keeps electing and having governors that are corrupt and ignorant time after time after time, to me that says one of those things. Well, either Puerto Ricans are just terrible, inferior people who don't know how to, we're brown people, we're from an island. I don't know what people think, why we would be
Right.
inferior and just like we're always making the same mistakes over and over again. And that's
Right.
certainly what a lot of people think, frankly, because this idea that, was expressed by the US back at the turn of the century of like Puerto Ricans are savages and that's why we can't make them state or give them self government. That idea is alive and well. It's just sort of said with prettier words now. Um,
Mm.
but it's either Puerto Ricans are just like terrible and inferior, or we're stuck in a system that is corrupt and corrupting, and it keeps, reproducing these same corrupt outcomes. So sometimes I use this analogy, like if you're trying to build a house and every engineer or architect that you hire comes in and builds the house and the house immediately falls down, and the next one comes and he builds the house again a slightly different way, it immediately falls down, and you do this 27 times and the house always falls down, what's more likely, that you've hired 27 bad engineers in a row, or that you're working with bad materials, that your wood is rotten, that your cement was poorly put together? And And so that's what I think Puerto Rico's working with. We're working with bad materials. We're working with in the context of a system, a colonial system that breeds corruption, that
Right.
also just breeds bad outcomes that then, cause public officials to make bad moves and bad decisions. That's not an excuse, right? They deserve the blame for the things that they've done, but they've done it within that corrupting system. But the other thing I think that you said is incredibly important. Like, if we're going to talk about corruption, and if we're going to say that, oh, a place that is so corrupt doesn't deserve, self-government or sovereignty, when are we taking away the United States sovereignty?
Right.
When are we giving the U.S. back to England? Because there's a lot of corruption in the U.S. right now, and always has been, right? And like you said, in every city, in every state, and certainly right now in the federal government. So Puerto Rico's right to govern itself, Puerto Rico's right to be free from colonialism. Rights can't be conditional. That's what makes them rights. So it can't be like Puerto Rico gets to be free if they act right. Puerto Rico gets
Right.
to be free if they get their act together. Um, you know, we don't we can't tell people that they only get to have rights if they meet certain conditions or if they're going to behave in the way that we want them to behave. Now, ideally, both things happen, right? Ideally, people get their rights and then they use them well and then they act right. But we cannot sit here and say, oh, until Puerto Rico does X, Y, and Z, it really can't be or doesn't deserve to be independent, because that's a slippery slope you know, to what has happened actually, which is 127 years, under a corrupt and corrupting colonial system. Like we've been talking about all this time, I think it's really important and accurate to call Puerto Rico a colony and to think of Puerto Rico as a colony. A lot of
Absolutely.
these other, words that get thrown around like territory, Commonwealth, they're really euphemisms for a relationship that is colonial, a relationship that is of political domination. Um, there's no exact, believe it or not, there's no sort of exact single definition of colony in the in the that's sort of accepted by all international law scholars. But the basic idea
Right.
is, does somebody else control your politics, in whole or in part? In the case of Puerto Rico, yes, because federal laws apply to Puerto Rico, because the U.S. president, signs those laws, because the president can send Puerto Ricans to war. Um, Now, as of 10 years ago, because the president appoints the overlords of Puerto Rico through this junta. So, yes, the US government has significant control over Puerto Rico. And then, does Puerto Rico have political rights in the US government? No, because the island residents only elect a single delegate to Congress who cannot vote on legislation. So, they're basically kind of there as window dressing,
Right.
because what's a legislator without a vote? Um, and then Puerto Ricans can't vote for the U.S. president. So we have a system in which the U.S. government largely controls Puerto Rico, and Puerto Ricans do not control anything that happens in the U.S. government. And I think that's about as classic a definition of colonialism as you could have. I think on a sort of ideological, political, moral level, if you believe that Puerto Rico is a nation, is a distinct nation, which I think many of us do, um, then Puerto Rico is an occupied nation, right? It's not just like that there's a bunch of Americans who are living on an island somewhere. It's that Puerto Rico is a distinct and unique nation filled with a people who have, a distinct culture and national identity. Um, and what that means is that what the U.S. did in 1898, was invade a nation and has kept a nation as a colony for the last 127 years. And I would hope that most people agree that just as if the United States invaded a nation tomorrow, they shouldn't just get to add it as a state and go on like a annexation spree. If you invade a place, you should free it, not keep it. Um, so to me, that's at the political and moral center of the argument against statehood. Um, part of Puerto Rico being a nation is having its own, as I said, identity and culture. And I think many of us are concerned about what would happen to Puerto Rico's identity under statehood. You know, as Bad Bunny has been singing about lo que le pasó a Hawaii, right? What happened to Hawaii? I think we've seen what happens to, you know, the native population and native culture of a place when it becomes a state. You know, you have the Hawaiian language having to get rescued from the brink of extinction, basically. You know, you have Hawaiian culture becoming a commodity for tourists in a way more than a meaningful expression of the culture of the people who live there. So, you know, would Spanish continue to be the language of government and education and public life in Puerto Rico if it became a state? Some people think so, but I look around the 50 states and I don't see any example of any place where any language other than English is, you know, the main language used in society. So I think there's every reason to believe that a similar thing would happen to Puerto Rico. So there's that cultural piece of the argument. There's an economic piece as well, which a lot of people think, oh, this is really where the statehood argument shines. It's economics. Puerto Rico's going to get all this, you know, extra federal money. It's going to get a little, or it would get a little, if statehood were possible, and we'll get to that. But Puerto Rico already gets a ton of federal money, and it has not been enough to lift Puerto Ricans out of poverty. So, you know, statehood would close some of those gaps. It would add, you know, a few billion here and there, but it's not like it would double or triple the amount of money that Puerto Rico gets. And what statehood would also do is that to all those high local taxes that already exist in Puerto Rico, now add full federal income tax.
Right.
What does that do to the Puerto Rican middle class, which barely exists anyway, you know, when you have even higher taxation? What does that do to corporations, to companies, manufacturers, for example, that right now are operating in Puerto Rico because they don't pay federal income tax in Puerto Rico? So there was an analysis done by an economist that suggests that if even 10 to 20% of manufacturers left after statehood because suddenly they have this to foot this huge tax bill too, the Puerto Rican economy would collapse. So these are the pieces of statehood of, you know, what's the impact of federal taxation going to be, that people don't talk about. They think it's all a benefit. They think it's all getting more money, but there's this other piece of what would happen economically under statehood too. And then finally, or maybe not finally, because I think there's 100 other arguments, but the other big one for me, and the one I think it's really important to think about in this moment is, as I said, it's been 127 years of this colonial status. The United States could have made Puerto Rico a state at any point in those 127 years. It has chosen not to do that. And I think it's actually, believe it or not, farther away now than it's ever been. Any change to Puerto Rico status, including statehood, of course, would take an act of Congress. That means you need to get 60 votes in the Senate for Puerto Rican statehood, which, you know, depending on how the math in the Senate is at any given point, means getting, you know, 8, 10, 12 Republican senators to vote for Puerto Rico statehood. Look around US politics right now and tell me when you think 10 Republican senators are going to vote for giving, you know, 3 million Latinos the power to vote for president, for sending billions of dollars more to some poor brown people in the Caribbean, for letting those poor brown people elect members to Congress that, rightly or wrongly, they're convinced are going to be Democrats and alter the balance of power in Congress, you know, nearly permanently. In what universe does that happen? It can't. And that's why no single status bill, no legislation to change Puerto Rico status has ever, you know, passed in Congress in the last like 50, 60 years, because Congress will not even consider the possibility that it could be forced to grant statehood to Puerto Rico if Puerto Ricans vote for it. They're just simply not willing to do it. Mostly the Republicans, but a lot of Democrats don't really care about it either.
Right.
And so the other argument against statehood is that it is politically impossible in the United States, and every second that we spend pretending that it could happen is another second that Puerto Rico stays stuck with this colonial, you know, harmful colonial status. Yeah, and that free association, and this is really important that you bring it up, because it's a term that causes a lot of confusion, because the current technically status of Puerto Rico, in Spanish at least, is called Estado Libre Asociado, which literally translates to free associated state. A lot of us like to say that that's kind of the ultimate irony, because Puerto Rico is not free. It's not really associated to the U.S. It's, dominated by it, and it's not a state. So why that term with those three words? But anyway, that is the name of the status quo as it exists. But there is a separate type of political status called free association, or I think more accurately, sovereign free association, which is basically a form of independence. Like if Puerto Rico became, went under the status, it would technically be an independent nation, but it would sign a bilateral compact with the United States, basically a negotiated agreement that says, for example, well, you're free, but we're going to keep, allowing you to have dual citizenship, or we're going to keep sending you, this much money in federal aid in exchange for, whatever it is, like something that's very much in the news right now, keeping 2 military bases in Puerto Rico, which I don't like, but are the kinds of things that could go into that sort of agreement. So free association is a form of sovereignty in which Puerto Rico would be free, but would then sign one of these agreements with the United States. And it's a legitimate option. It got 30% of the vote in the plebiscite in Puerto Rico last year. I personally don't love it or support it, because I'm just not sure that we would get the United States government to cut Puerto Rico a good deal, right? We're just talking about negotiating. Imagine right now trying to negotiate one of those compacts with the Trump administration. So I think there's a lot of questions, and it's hard because it's so much about what would go into that agreement, which we obviously don't have and can't see in advance. So it's kind of like, what are we voting for when we vote for free association? So, personally, I'm a supporter of full independence, but I recognize that free association is a legitimate, sovereign status that would end, colonialism in Puerto Rico, at least technically. So I think it should be part of the conversation. Okay. Why independence? I mean, in a way, it's sort of the inverse of all of the arguments I made against statehood, right? It's, Puerto Rico is a nation. It was invaded. It's been occupied. It's been colonized. I think nations deserve to be free. I think nations deserve self-government. I think it's the only way for Puerto Ricans to govern ourselves in a way that is consistent with who we are as a people and with our values. And right now we have, incredibly concrete examples of what the consequences are when we can't do that. Puerto Rico as a colony right now, and obviously it would be the same as if it were a state, doesn't control its own immigration policy. Only, the federal government controls immigration policy. So what does that mean? It means that we have, ICE and Homeland Security raiding Puerto Rican communities every day, rounding up our Dominican and Haitian and Cuban and Venezuelan brothers and sisters, and taking them away. So we can't even decide who gets to live on our own land. That's a consequence of colonialism, and it would be the same under statehood, just like it's happening in, California and in all these other places where maybe the state's governor doesn't like it, but it's up to the federal government. So it's just one example, but I think a really relevant one of why, the sovereignty of a nation is so important to be able to make those decisions. It's important to be able to safeguard our identity and our culture so that we don't, fall prey to the assimilation that comes with annexation. Independence would give us a lot of the economic tools that Puerto Rico currently doesn't have, and again wouldn't have as a state, because they're tools of independent nations, of countries. So signing trade deals, controlling our ports and our territorial waters so that we can establish duties and port fees and set tariffs, the ability to be free of things like the Jones Act, which would remain if Puerto Rico were a state, because again, the Jones Act is a law that applies to everywhere. It just affects Puerto Rico more because it's an island, but it's a federal law for every state. And even things like the Interstate Commerce Clause and these other federal laws that govern, what states can do economically. There was one analysis that suggested that Puerto Rico could make up to $20 billion more a year in exports if it were not subject to the interstate commerce clause. So these are only things that can happen, um, under independence. And then finally, to this point of what's politically feasible in the United States, again, it's kind of the opposite of the argument against statehood. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's easy to get to pass a law for independence tomorrow, to get 60 votes for it in the Senate, but I do think it's a lot easier than with statehood, because you do have Republicans who, even if it's for racist reasons that we don't like, would just love to stop sending money to Puerto Rico. They think that's throwing money down the drain, like sending food stamps to some people in the Caribbean. Like, why do that? And again, Republicans especially are scared that if Puerto Rico became a state, they would elect more Democrats to Congress, and that obviously hurts them. Well, the only way to stop that from ever happening is to just get rid of Puerto Rico, right? Like that eliminates the threat of statehood forever. So I do think independence is actually more politically feasible in Congress as well, and that's a lot of the work that we do at Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, but PR, making the argument to both Democrats and to Republicans that this is something that Puerto Rico needs, that's good for Puerto Rico, and that would be good for the United States as well, because having a colony in the 21st century is not a great look. Point, and it's so funny you say that, because I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine earlier today. Most of us who believe in independence believe that it's not to become an enemy of the U.S. It's not to become like an isolated country in the world. It's to have cooperation and friendship and good relations with the U.S. and with a lot of other countries in the world. And it would be mutually beneficial for all of us to do that, especially while there are 6 million Puerto Ricans in the U.S. We in the diaspora are the best argument for why it's important to have that good relationship, and the best sort of political force to make sure that it happens. So yeah, a lot of these ideas about like, oh, Puerto Rico is just going to be the next Cuba and it's going to be this adversarial thing, these are a lot of the old sort of Cold War fears and talking points, that you're either with us or against us, or independence is communism and all of this stuff, and it's fear mongering, it's talking points, it's really not serious, but yeah, like I said, most of us who want independence want it so that we can, be on equal footing with the United States and have a relationship of partners and equals, not enemies. It's funny because we've been having so much conversation talking about so many of these complicated issues and political and economic about Puerto Rico, and and this might be the hardest question because
yeah, right.
Because it's just like I don't even know how to answer. It's like asking me what it means to be alive. It's just who I am. I was born and raised there, although I'd like to think of, even if I hadn't been born and raised there, like that identity is still there. And I say this very frequently for Puerto Ricans in the diaspora who are second gen, third gen, or whatever generation we're up to. Like, I hope that they embrace that Puerto Rican identity just as much as those of us who were born on the island, and embrace the, like we were talking about a while back, embrace the responsibility that comes with that Puerto Rican identity, and that if you're going to wave that flag, then fight for it, defend it, get involved in these issues. So honestly, to me right now, I think being Puerto Rican, beyond just the basics that like it's where I was born and it's my ethnic identity or whatever you want to call it, to me it's really that, it's that commitment, it's that saying and thinking and feeling, okay, I'm gonna take action, I'm gonna keep fighting for for my people, on the island and here in the diaspora. And I think anybody who feels that commitment, who feels that drive, who feels that desire to to do something for the Puerto Rican people is Puerto Rican in my book. Yeah, I mean, let me start with the second part of that question first. I hope that the world will view us as it's about time. And, I hope that people in the world are waiting for us, to the extent that people think about Puerto Rico at all, which unfortunately isn't all that much. But I hope they'll see us as finally having caught up to, what 190 other nations in the world caught up to, like,
Right.
having our own nation and having full freedom. Sometimes I speak with folks from other Latin American countries, and they're so confused about Puerto Rico's political status. And I get it, because if you're like Colombian or something and your country's been free since 1800 something, it's like doesn't compute that Puerto Rico or any place would still be a colony in 2025. So I hope that all peoples, and especially our Latin American brothers and sisters, will welcome us with open arms to that sort of brotherhood of nations. And kind of just like we're saying with the relationship with the U.S., I think I hope that a free Puerto Rico will also be a friend and partner to nations across Latin America and around the world, really. In terms of quality of life, it's hard to say. And I'm not going to be one of these people who sits here and says that independence automatically solves every problem, and it's an immediate positive impact. Like, we're not going to undo 127 years of political and economic dependence, with the snap of a finger. And by the way, most serious proposals for independence take that into account and propose a long transition process that includes some continued federal funding from the US government. So, for example, in the Puerto Rico Status Act, which is the last bill on Puerto Rico status that passed at least one chamber in Congress. It passed the House in 2022. Again, never even made it to the Senate. That bill envisioned a 20-year transition period in which, for the first 10 years, Puerto Rico would get the same level of federal funding that it was getting before independence. And then for the next 10 years after that, it would decrease by 10% each year, so you get to 20 years. So there's a recognition, and again, this isn't a pipe dream. This is actual legislative text that passed the House of Representatives. There is a recognition that there has to be a transition period, that the U.S. has to account for the time that it's going to take for Puerto Rico to set up its own institutions, to stabilize its economy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the extent to which a transition like that happens, and how generous and how long it takes, is going to be a big part of determining what Puerto Rico's quality of life will be after independence. Like any other place in the world, Puerto Rico has to be governed well, right? If it's governed well, it'll thrive. If it's governed poorly, it'll suffer. That just can't be something that stops us. The fact that things might go poorly can't be something that stops us from pursuing independence, for the same reason that, like, when you turn 18 or 20 or whatever age and you move out of your parents' house, there's no guarantee that you're going to do well in life. You don't know what your quality of life is going to be, 1 or 2 years down the line. You don't know if you're going to struggle. In fact, you probably will struggle a little bit, but you still move out of your parents' house, right? Even if that's a more uncertain future than just like staying there forever, because you recognize that that's what you should do as an adult and as an independent person, is lead your own life, come what may, in terms of struggles, and you hope to make it and you work to make it. I think it's the same thing for Puerto Rico. Like, we can't know exactly what the future will hold, but we can't let that uncertainty, stop us and keep us paralyzed, because we know what the present holds, and the present is not good.
Not at all, man. The president is just more abuse and abuse, and even more abuse. But here on this platform, we believe in independence, and I have no doubt, like you said, the beginning will be a little rough, naturally so, right? We've been a colony for over 100 years, over 120, 28 years, 27 years.
Yeah,
But
127.
our people are resilient, man, and they're brilliant. We have brilliant minds. I have no doubt that people would move back to Puerto Rico if it was independent tomorrow. I know I would. I would move back, and I'll figure it out. I'll figure out what life would be like there. But I'll do anything to help my country, you know? And I think a lot of other Puerto Ricans who are probably physicians, doctors, military people, economists, I think a lot of them will move back to Puerto Rico and try to help Puerto Rico figure it out. So, you know, the struggle continues, but it's coming soon, man. I feel it.
Yeah. And no, and that last part you said, and I know we're probably got to wrap up soon, but I just want to really highlight that because it's so important, the like we'll figure it out part and the trust in our people, you know, and understanding that we have experts, that we have leaders, that we have
Right,
economists. So this is what I tell to a lot of people who, you know, hesitate to support independence because they can't answer every question about it. They don't know exactly how it's going to go. They don't know what the plan is. This is the other question that we
right,
get a lot. It's like, what's the plan for independence? It's like, I don't know, man. What's the plan to fight climate change? Like, I don't
right,
have it, but I still
right,
support fighting climate change because I know that there's really smart people out there that are working on it. And it doesn't have to be me. Like, my job as an activist is to fight for what I think is right, not to be able to like answer every single question about the details and the technicalities of how it's going to go. You know, like you said, Puerto Rico has leaders, it has experts, it has people that have been thinking and writing and planning and talking about this stuff for decades. So we have to believe in ourselves as a people. We have to believe in our capacity, and I think, like you said, a lot of us, I think, will would or hopefully will go back to an independent Puerto Rico to just have that feeling of, you know, helping to build our new nation.
absolutely. Alberto Medina, president of Bud PR. I thank you for your time, brother. Means a lot. And hopefully we could do this again soon.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to be back, and I hope folks will check out budpr.org, budpr.org. You know, we need collaborators, we need volunteers, we need donors. We need to keep strengthening the movement for Puerto Rican independence, and that's something that each and every one of us can do in some small way here in the diaspora.